Tonight, we journey into the life of a man who reshaped history with nothing but his curiosity and determination. Picture a young boy, barefoot in the streets of Boston, watching ships sail toward horizons he could only imagine. See him years later, standing before kings and philosophers, his simple presence commanding respect across 2 continents. Imagine him alone in a field during a thunderstorm, reaching toward the heavens to unlock secrets that would illuminate the world. This is not just another story of Benjamin Franklin. Tonight, we explore the hidden chambers of his remarkable life, the quiet moments of doubt and discovery that history often overlooks. We will walk beside him through candlelit print shops, where the smell of ink and paper filled the air with possibility. We will stand with him in Philadelphia's muddy streets as he transforms a provincial town into a beacon of enlightenment. We will cross the Atlantic in creaking wooden vessels, feeling the salt spray and uncertainty of journeys that changed the course of nations. Benjamin Franklin was many things. A printer who never stopped learning, a scientist who asked questions no one else dared to ask, a diplomat who charmed the courts of Europe, a founding father who helped birth a nation. But he was also something more elusive and more human. He was a man of contradictions, brilliant yet humble, ambitious yet generous, flawed yet magnificent. He owned slaves, yet fought for abolition. He abandoned his family, yet created institutions that served millions. He sought fame, yet gave away his inventions freely. Tonight, as you relax and let the tensions of your day dissolve, we will discover the Franklin that history books often miss. Not the marble statue or the face on currency, but the living, breathing human being who walked through the same world of joy and sorrow, triumph and failure that we all inhabit. We will see how a boy with no advantages beyond his own mind became one of the most influential people in history. We will understand how curiosity, discipline, and an unshakable belief in human progress can transform not just one life, but the entire world. Let the gentle rhythm of this story carry you toward peaceful rest. There is no hurry here, no urgency. We have all night to explore the corners of Franklin's world, to understand the choices he made, the ideas that drove him, and the legacy he left behind. Each chapter of his life unfolds like the pages of a book written across 8 decades of revolutionary change. So settle deeper into comfort. Let your breathing slow and your thoughts quiet. We are about to embark on a journey through colonial America, Georgian England, and revolutionary France. We will witness the birth of modern science, the creation of a nation, and the triumph of human ingenuity over seemingly insurmountable obstacles. This is Benjamin Franklin's untold story, told not to excite or alarm, but to gently guide you through the remarkable landscape of one extraordinary life, allowing you to drift peacefully into dreams enriched by wonder and possibility. The journey begins now, in a small house on Milk Street in Boston, where candlelight flickers against wooden walls and the smell of tallow fills the air. A child is about to enter the world, and with him, the future of a nation yet unborn. Chapter 1. The Candlemaker's Son. The winter wind howled through the narrow streets of Boston on that January morning in 1706, carrying with it the sharp scent of wood smoke and the distant cry of gulls circling the harbor. Inside a modest wooden house on Milk Street, Abiah Franklin prepared to bring her 8th child into the world. The room was warm, heated by a fire that cast dancing shadows on the walls, and filled with the quiet movements of midwives who had delivered countless babies in this Puritan town, where life and death walked hand in hand. When the baby finally emerged, his cry was strong and healthy. They named him Benjamin, a biblical name meaning son of the right hand, and before the day ended, they carried him through the cold streets to Old South Church, where Reverend Samuel Willard baptized him in water, blessed for the purpose. The haste was necessary. In colonial Boston, death came quickly for the young, and parents wanted to ensure their children's souls were secured should God call them home before they could speak their own prayers. Benjamin entered a world that moved at the pace of horses and sailing ships, where news from England took months to arrive, where most people lived and died within a few miles of their birthplace, where the rhythms of life were marked by church bells and the changing seasons. Boston in 1706 was a town of perhaps 7,000 souls, clustered on a peninsula, connected to the mainland by a narrow strip of land that flooded at high tide. The houses were mostly wooden, built close together, their second stories sometimes overhanging the street to capture a few more square feet of precious space. The Franklin home was crowded beyond what we would consider tolerable today. Josiah Franklin, Benjamin's father, had 17 children from 2 marriages, and though not all lived at home simultaneously, the house was never quiet. Children slept 3 or 4 to a bed, sharing warmth in winter and sweltering together in summer. Privacy was a luxury unknown to working people. Every sound carried through thin walls. Every meal was a communal affair. Every space served multiple purposes. The ground floor of the house was dominated by Josiah's tallow chandler shop, where he transformed animal fat into candles and soap. The work was unglamorous and unpleasant. Raw fat arrived from butchers, often rank and crawling with maggots in warm weather. It had to be rendered in great iron kettles over hot fires, the process filling the house with an acrid smell that clung to clothes and hair and could never quite be washed away. The rendered tallow was poured into molds around cotton or flax wicks, creating candles that were essential for every household in an age before gas or electric light. Soap making was similarly malodorous. Josiah would mix the rendered fat with lye made from wood ashes, stirring the caustic mixture until chemical reactions transformed it into something that could actually clean clothes and bodies. The lye burned skin if handled carelessly, and the smell of soap making was perhaps even worse than candle making, a combination of rancid fat and harsh chemicals that made eyes water and throats burn. Yet from this humble and unpleasant trade, Josiah Franklin managed to support his enormous family. He was industrious and frugal, careful with every penny, wasting nothing. Scraps of tallow were saved and remelted. Damaged candles were reformed. Every resource was used to its fullest. It was a lesson young Benjamin absorbed without conscious effort. This idea that waste was sinful and that careful management of resources was both practical wisdom and moral virtue. But the Franklin household offered riches that transcended material comfort. Josiah was a thoughtful man who valued ideas and learning despite his lack of formal education. He could read and write competently, skills that many tradesmen lacked, and he loved conversation about serious matters. Several evenings a week, he invited educated friends to share the family's simple meals, and the conversation around the Franklin table ranged far beyond the daily concerns of a tallow chandler. Ministers would debate fine points of theology, discussing predestination and free will, the nature of grace, the proper interpretation of difficult biblical passages. Merchants would share news from London and the other colonies, talking of wars in Europe, changes in government, new ideas circulating among the educated classes. Craftsmen would discuss their trades, explaining techniques and sharing observations about the materials they worked with and the principles that governed their crafts. Young Benjamin would sit at the table, eating his bread and butter, listening with an intensity that the adults found remarkable in one so young. He absorbed everything, storing away knowledge and observations, learning that the world was far larger and more complex than the narrow streets of Boston suggested. He discovered that ideas could be thrilling, that questions could be as engaging as games, that the life of the mind was open to anyone willing to think seriously about important matters. His father encouraged this intellectual curiosity. Josiah had accumulated a small library, perhaps a dozen volumes, each one precious. The books were kept on a shelf above the fireplace, protected from the dampness that rotted paper and from careless hands that might damage them. The Bible, of course, occupied the place of honor, bound in leather with metal clasps, its pages thin as onion skin and covered in dense black type. But Josiah also owned John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, an allegorical tale of Christian's journey from the city of destruction to the celestial city. Young Benjamin read it so many times that he nearly memorized it, captivated by the vivid characters and dramatic scenes. He accompanied Christian through the slough of despond, climbed with him uphill difficulty, trembled with him in the valley of the shadow of death, and rejoiced when he finally crossed the river to reach eternal rest. More influential still was Plutarch's Lives, a collection of biographies of great Greeks and Romans written nearly 2,000 years earlier. These were not Christian stories, but pagan histories, tales of men who achieved greatness through virtue and wisdom before Christ was born. The Puritans accepted such works because they demonstrated that moral truth existed across all times and cultures, that God had written his law on human hearts even before the gospel was revealed. From Plutarch, Benjamin learned about Lycurgus, who gave Sparta its laws, and then starved himself to death to ensure those laws would never be changed. He read about Solon, who reformed Athens and then left the city for 10 years, so the people would have to learn to govern themselves without his guidance. He discovered Alexander, who conquered the known world by age 30, and wept because there were no more worlds to conquer. He encountered Cicero, whose eloquence saved Rome from a conspiracy, and Cato, who chose death over dishonor when Caesar's dictatorship destroyed the Republic. These stories shaped Benjamin's moral imagination in profound ways. He learned that character was built through deliberate practice, that greatness required both virtue and ability, that the measure of a man was not his birth or wealth, but his actions and their consequences. He began to see his own life as a story being written, one that he could shape through his choices. Would his own biography be worthy of Plutarch's collection? The question would drive him for the rest of his life. His mother, Abia, was equally important to his development, though in different ways. She was a strong, capable woman who managed the enormous household with efficiency and warmth that amazed those who witnessed it. 17 children, though not all living at home at once, represented an overwhelming responsibility. The cooking alone was a monumental task. Bread had to be baked daily, often multiple loaves to feed the hungry crowd. Meals had to be prepared over an open fire, requiring constant attention to prevent burning or undercooking. Clothes had to be made, mended, and washed by hand in water, carried from wells or the harbor. Children needed constant supervision, teaching, and discipline. The youngest required diaper changes and nursing. The older ones needed guidance in their chores and education in basic skills. Illness was frequent and could be deadly. A simple fever might carry off a child in days, and Abia had buried several of her babies. Each loss a wound that never fully healed. Yet she managed it all, while also helping with the business, serving customers in the shop, keeping the household accounts, and ensuring the family lived within their modest means. She did this with good humor and patience that seemed inexhaustible. The Franklin household was not wealthy, but it was warm with love and rich in laughter. Abia was also literate, which was unusual for women of her class and time. Most women could not write their own names, signing documents with an X, but Abia could read fluently and write a clear hand. She had grown up in Nantucket, the daughter of Peter Folger, a remarkable man who was a miller, teacher, surveyor, and occasional poet. Peter Folger had learned the Wampanoag language and served as an interpreter between English settlers and Native Americans. He had written poems criticizing religious intolerance and advocating for liberty of conscience, a dangerous position in an age when dissent could lead to imprisonment or worse. This independent spirit passed through Abia to her son. She taught Benjamin to read before he could remember learning, sitting with him by firelight and guiding his small finger across the pages of books, sounding out letters and words until they became familiar and then automatic. She encouraged his curiosity, answered his endless questions, and never made him feel that wanting to know things was presumptuous or inappropriate for a child of his station. Boston Harbor became young Benjamin's playground and classroom. The waterfront was only a short walk from Milk Street, and boys were allowed to roam relatively freely as long as they completed their chores and stayed out of serious trouble. Benjamin and his friends would spend hours at the wharves, watching ships arrive from England, the Caribbean, and the other colonies. They would listen to sailors' stories of distant lands, strange peoples, and adventures on the high seas. The harbor itself was endlessly fascinating. At low tide, the mud flats were exposed, and boys would dig for clams and search for treasures washed ashore. At high tide, the water was deep enough for swimming, and Benjamin became one of the strongest swimmers among the local boys. He loved the water, loved the feeling of gliding through it, loved the challenge of swimming farther and faster than anyone else. He began to experiment, even as a child, with ways to improve his swimming. He fashioned crude flippers from wood, tying them to his hands and feet to increase his surface area and speed through the water. He taught himself to float on his back for long periods, studying the behavior of the currents and the way the water supported his body. He discovered that relaxation was more effective than struggle, that the water would hold him up if he trusted it and worked with it rather than fighting against it. One summer day, he performed an experiment that impressed all who witnessed it. He had made a kite and gotten it flying high above the harbor. Then he lay on his back in the water, holding the kite string, and let the wind pull him across the surface. He glided along, towed by the kite, covering a distance that would have exhausted him if he had swum it. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it revealed the pattern of thinking that would characterize his entire life. Observe a problem, imagine a solution, test it, and refine it until it works. His father watched Benjamin's development with mixed feelings. The boy was clearly intelligent, perhaps the brightest of all Josiah's children. He learned quickly, questioned everything, and displayed a hunger for knowledge that could not be satisfied by the resources available in a tallow chandler's shop. Josiah began to harbor a special ambition for his 15th child and 10th son. In Puritan tradition, there was the concept of tithing one's children to God, dedicating one of every 10 to religious service. Benjamin, as the 10th son, would be tithed to the church. He would become a minister, receiving the education necessary for that most respected of callings. Ministers were the intellectual elite of colonial society, men who had studied at Harvard College, who knew Latin and Greek, who could read theology and philosophy in the original languages, who commanded respect from rich and poor alike. The decision made, Josiah enrolled 8-year-old Benjamin in Boston Latin School, the most prestigious educational institution in the colony. Founded in 1635, it was America's first public school designed to prepare boys for Harvard by drilling them in classical languages and literature. The curriculum was rigorous and demanding. Boys entered knowing only English and left reading Cicero and Virgil in Latin, Homer, and Demosthenes in Greek. Benjamin loved it. For the first time in his life, he was surrounded by learning. Every day brought new challenges, new knowledge, new skills to master. He excelled immediately, rising to the head of his class with a speed that impressed his teachers. They praised his quickness, his memory, his ability to grasp complex grammatical structures and apply them correctly. They predicted a brilliant future for this tradesman's son, who seemed destined for scholarly greatness. But Josiah Franklin was doing calculations of his own. Even a public school like Boston Latin involved costs. There were fees for books, supplies, and special instruction. There was the lost labor, as Benjamin's time in school meant he could not contribute to the family business. And beyond Boston Latin loomed the far greater expense of Harvard College, where tuition, room, board, and books would cost more than Josiah earned in several years. The family simply could not afford it. After less than a year, despite Benjamin's success and his teachers' protestations, Josiah withdrew his son from Boston Latin School. The dream of ministry was over. Benjamin's formal education was about to end at age 9, but his real education, the one that would transform him into one of the most learned men of his age, was just beginning.
Chapter 2. The printer's devil, Josiah Franklin, was not a man who gave up easily. If Harvard was beyond reach, perhaps a less expensive education could still be arranged for his bright youngest son. Enrolled 10-year-old Benjamin in a school run by George Brownell that focused on practical subjects rather than classical languages. Here, boys learned writing, arithmetic, and other skills useful for commerce. No Latin or Greek, no preparation for university, but the tools needed for success in trade. Benjamin excelled at writing, but struggled oddly with arithmetic, a weakness that would puzzle him in later years given his facility with numbers and scientific work. But even this modest education was brief. The expense was still too great for the family budget. After less than a year at Brownell School, at age 10, Benjamin Franklin's formal education ended forever. He would never sit in another classroom, never study under another teacher, never earn a diploma or degree through conventional means. Josiah brought his son into the family business. At 10 years old, Benjamin began working full-time in his father's tallow chandler shop. The work was tedious, unpleasant, and mind-numbing for a boy who had tasted the excitement of learning. He cut wicks to uniform lengths, hour after hour, the rough hemp fibers leaving his fingers raw. He filled candle molds, pouring the hot tallow carefully to avoid air bubbles that would weaken the finished product. He tended the fires under the great rendering kettles, feeding wood into the flames and stirring the bubbling fat to prevent it from burning. The smell was inescapable. Rendering animal fat produces an acrid, greasy smoke that penetrates everything. Benjamin's clothes reeked of it. His hair absorbed it. He could taste it in his food. Even when he was away from the shop, the smell followed him, marking him as a tradesman's son, someone who worked with his hands in an unglamorous occupation. He hated every moment of it. At night, lying in the bed he shared with his brothers, he would dream of escape. The sea called to him with particular intensity. Boston was a maritime town, and the life of a sailor offered adventure, freedom, and escape from the suffocating confines of the tallow chandler shop. He could sail to the Caribbean, to England, to the mysterious lands beyond the horizon, could see the world instead of spending his life rendering fat and pouring candles. But Josiah had already lost one son to the sea. Peter Franklin had gone to sea as a young man and simply disappeared, probably dead in a shipwreck or from disease in some foreign port. The loss had devastated Josiah, and he was determined that Benjamin would not follow the same path. The sea was dangerous, uncertain, and often deadly. A safer trade was needed, one that would satisfy Benjamin's obvious intelligence while keeping him on land. For the next year or more, Josiah took Benjamin on walks through Boston, visiting workshops and observing various craftsmen at their trades. It was an education in itself, a systematic survey of the artisan world. They watched joiners shaping wood with planes and chisels, transforming rough lumber into smooth furniture. They observed bricklayers building walls, each brick placed with practiced precision, the mortar squeezed out evenly between courses. They saw turners working their lathes, spinning wood at high speed while holding sharp tools against it to create perfect cylinders and curves. They visited braziers who cast brass and copper objects, pouring molten metal into sand molds. They watched blacksmiths forging iron, heating it in coal fires until it glowed orange, and then hammering it into tools and hardware. They observed coopers making barrels, bending wooden staves around hoops with techniques that required years to master. They saw shipwrights, building vessels, constructing the complex, three-dimensional puzzles that would carry cargo and passengers across the ocean. Benjamin absorbed everything. He observed how things were made, how tools functioned, how skilled craftsmen could shape raw materials into useful objects. He noted the techniques each trade required, the specialized knowledge that separated masters from apprentices. The experience gave him an invaluable education in practical mechanics, a foundation that would serve him well when he later turned to scientific experimentation and invention. But nothing captured his imagination the way books did. While his father searched for the right trade, Benjamin was educating himself through reading. He spent every spare penny on books, though spare pennies were rare in his life. He borrowed volumes from anyone who would lend them, promising to return them in perfect condition and always keeping his word. He read by candlelight after his work was done, straining his eyes in the dim flickering light, but unable to stop himself from turning page after page. He discovered John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress and read it until he nearly memorized every word. The allegorical tale spoke to something deep within him, this idea of a journey toward something better, of obstacles overcome through persistence and faith. He read Daniel Defoe's essay on projects, which argued for practical improvements to society through mutual benefit organizations. The concept fascinated him, people voluntarily joining together to achieve what none could accomplish alone. He would return to this idea again and again throughout his life. He found a book by a Socinian writer, forgotten now, that used the Socratic method to argue religious points. The technique captured his imagination more than the arguments themselves. By asking questions and allowing the other person to reason toward conclusions, one could teach more effectively than through direct assertion. Benjamin began using this method in conversation, asking questions rather than making statements, guiding people to see things from new perspectives without directly confronting their beliefs. He discovered that people resented being told they were wrong, but enjoyed arriving at new insights through their own reasoning. The Socratic method became one of his most effective tools, useful in everything from friendly debate to diplomatic negotiation. It would serve him well in the print shop debates of his youth, in the philosophical discussions of the Junto, and later in the complex negotiations that created a nation. At 12 years old, Benjamin Franklin was an apprentice candlemaker who lived in books, who dreamed in ideas, whose mind ranged far beyond the narrow confines of his daily labor. And then his older brother James returned to Boston with a plan that would change everything. James Franklin was 9 years older than Benjamin, old enough to have completed his own apprenticeship, and established himself as a printer in London, where he learned the trade at the finest shops in the English-speaking world. In 1717, he returned to Boston and set up a printing shop on Queen Street. The fourth printing establishment in the city, printing was one of the most important trades in the colonial world, combining mechanical skill with intellectual engagement in ways that few other occupations offered. Printers produced everything from legal documents and government proclamations to books, pamphlets, and newspapers. A good printer needed literacy, obviously, but also mechanical aptitude, business sense, and often served as writer and editor as well. It was the perfect occupation for someone of Benjamin's abilities. Josiah saw his opportunity. He approached James about taking Benjamin as an apprentice, and after some negotiation, an agreement was reached. In 1718, 12-year-old Benjamin Franklin signed indentures that would bind him to his brother until age 21. 9 years of service in exchange for training in the printing trade, room and board, and one complete set of clothes at the end of his term. The contract was standard for the time, but the relationship would prove anything but ordinary. The dynamics were complicated from the start. James was the master, entitled to Benjamin's obedience and labor. Benjamin was the apprentice, legally bound to serve without complaint. But Benjamin was also James's younger brother, someone who had played with him as a child, who knew his weaknesses and flaws. And more problematically, Benjamin was brighter than James, quicker to learn, more creative in his thinking. The inequality of talent strained against the inequality of authority. James could command and punish, as was his right as master. But he could not command respect based on superior ability, because everyone in the shop gradually realized that the apprentice was more talented than the master. This tension would eventually explode, but in the beginning, Benjamin was simply grateful to escape the tallow chandler shop. The print shop was a world of ideas made tangible. Every day brought new text to be set in type, new arguments to be composed, new knowledge to absorb. The work was physically demanding but intellectually stimulating in ways that rendering fat had never been. Benjamin took to it with passionate enthusiasm. The process of printing in the early 18th century was entirely manual, requiring both technical skill and considerable physical strength. The first step was composition, setting individual letters of type into words and sentences. The type was stored in a case, a shallow wooden tray divided into compartments, each holding letters of a particular size and face. Capital letters were in the uppercase, small letters in the lowercase, the origin of terms we still use today. The compositor would stand at the case, holding a composing stick in his left hand, a small metal tray that held perhaps 4 inches of type. With his right hand, he would select letters from the case, placing them upside down and backward in the composing stick. A skilled compositor could do this without looking, his fingers knowing by touch and position which compartment held which letter. He would read the manuscript, translate it mentally into reverse type, and set it letter by letter, word by word, line by line. It required incredible concentration and accuracy. A single misplaced letter could change the meaning of a sentence. A wrong font or size could ruin the appearance of a page. The compositor had to think about spacing, about how words would break at line ends, about keeping the text justified so that both left and right margins were straight. It was like solving a complex puzzle while standing up for hours at a time. When a form was complete, it would be locked into a metal frame called a chase. This frame was then placed on the bed of the press. The type was inked using leather balls covered with soft leather, the printer dabbing ink onto the raised surface of the type. A sheet of paper was positioned carefully on the tympan, a hinged frame that would hold it flat against the type. Then came the most physically demanding part. The printer would slide the bed under the platen, a flat surface that would press down on the paper. He would pull a long lever, bringing the platen down with enormous force, pressing the paper against the inked type. The lever required significant strength to operate, and printers pulled it hundreds or thousands of times per day. When the impression was made, the printer would lift the platen, slide the bed out, and carefully remove the printed sheet. The sheet would be hung on racks to dry, and the process would repeat. One sheet at a time, one impression at a time, until an entire edition was printed. For a book of several hundred pages, the process might take weeks or months. Every page had to be set in type, printed on both sides, and then the type had to be distributed back into the cases to be used again for the next page. Benjamin learned every aspect of this process. He became fast at composition, his fingers flying through the typecase with practiced precision. He learned to mix ink to the right consistency, not so thick that it clogged the type, not so thin that it made weak impressions. He learned to adjust the press for different papers and different jobs, to apply exactly the right amount of pressure to make clean impressions without crushing the paper or breaking the type. He also developed a systematic method of self-education that would serve him throughout his life. When he read something that impressed him, he would try to recreate it from memory, testing his understanding and identifying his weaknesses. He discovered a collection of essays called The Spectator, written by Joseph Addison and Richard Steele, and published daily in London. These essays were masterpieces of English prose, elegant, witty, and persuasive. Benjamin wanted to write like that, so he developed an elaborate training regimen. He would read an essay several times until he understood its structure and arguments. Then he would set it aside for several days to let the specific wording fade from his memory. Finally, he would try to rewrite the essay from his own understanding of its points. When he compared his version to the original, he could see exactly where his vocabulary was limited, where his arguments lacked force, where his sentence structure was clumsy. Then he would practice those specific skills. To expand his vocabulary, he converted essays from prose into poetry, forcing himself to find different words to maintain the meter and rhyme. Then he would convert his poetry back into prose, giving himself practice in using varied vocabulary. To improve his logical thinking, he would take an essay and scramble its arguments, writing each point on a separate slip of paper. Days later, he would try to rearrange them in the proper order, training himself to recognize logical progression and strong argument structure. It was a training regimen as rigorous and deliberate as an athlete's, applied to the craft of writing. In 1721, when Benjamin was 15, James Franklin made a bold and controversial decision. He would start a newspaper, only the fourth in the American colonies. He called it the New England Courant, and from its first issue, it was designed to provoke. Unlike the existing Boston newspapers, which simply reprinted news from London and official proclamations from the colonial government, the New England Courant featured original essays, satirical commentary, and criticism of authority. James published pieces questioning the Puritan clergy's promotion of smallpox inoculation, a new and controversial medical procedure that many Bostonians considered dangerous or even heretical. The reaction was explosive. Boston's religious and political establishment was outraged. How dare a mere printer, a tradesman of no particular education or standing, presume to criticize his betters? The ministers thundered from their pulpits. The government officials muttered about sedition, but the controversy sold papers. Everyone in Boston was talking about the Courant, and Benjamin watched, learning that in print, a commoner's words could carry as much weight as a gentleman's. He longed to contribute to the paper, to see his own words in print, but James dismissed his efforts. A teenage apprentice had nothing worth publishing. The rejection stung, but it also inspired one of the most famous deceptions in American literary history. Benjamin would create a fictional correspondent whose letters would captivate Boston and whose true identity would remain hidden even from James himself. The creation of Silence Dogood was about to teach both brothers an unforgettable lesson about talent, authority, and the power of the printed word. Chapter 3. Silence speaks late at night. After the print shop closed and the city fell quiet, Benjamin Franklin sat at his small table by candlelight and invented a person. She would be a widow, he decided, middle-aged and witty. Someone who had lived enough to have opinions, but who remained outside the established power structures that dominated Boston society. She would be educated enough to write well, but common enough to speak plainly. She would have the freedom that widowhood granted women, a kind of social permission to speak her mind that wives and unmarried girls did not possess. He named her Silence Dogood, a name that combined Puritan virtue with gentle irony. Silence was hardly silent, and she did much more than simply do good in the passive sense the name suggested. She observed the world sharply and commented on it fearlessly. Benjamin crafted her voice carefully, making her sound like a real person. Someone readers could imagine sitting across a table, sharing her thoughts over tea. The first letter was composed with meticulous care. Benjamin wrote in a disguised hand, altering his normal handwriting so James would not recognize it. He explained that Silence Dogood was the widow of a country minister, left with limited means but unlimited opinions about the state of society. She proposed to offer her observations on various topics, mixing moral reflections with social commentary and gentle satire. Late one night, Benjamin slipped the letter under the print shop door, positioning it so James would discover it when he opened for business in the morning. Then Benjamin went home, his heart pounding with nervous excitement, and waited to see what would happen. The next morning, James found the letter and read it aloud to the other printers and apprentices gathered in the shop. The men laughed at the witty observations and clever turns of phrase. They discussed who might have written it. Several suggested it must be someone educated, perhaps a minister using a pseudonym. Others thought it might be written by one of Boston's sophisticated ladies, someone who wanted to join the public conversation but needed the protection of anonymity. No one suspected the teenage apprentice standing quietly in the corner, setting type for other people's words while his own creation was being praised. James decided to publish the letter in the next edition of the Courant. Silence Dogood had made her debut. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Readers loved Silence's voice, her mixture of wisdom and wit, her willingness to comment on topics that others avoided. She criticized the affectation and pretension of Harvard students, suggesting that too much education could make young men useless for practical life. She mocked the elaborate fashions that wealthy women wore, arguing that true beauty came from virtue rather than expensive clothing. She questioned whether expensive mourning customs served any purpose beyond displaying wealth. Each essay was a small masterpiece of social observation, blending humor with genuine insight. Silence Dogood became the most popular feature in the New England Courant. Men gathered in taverns to discuss her latest letter. Women read the essays aloud to each other. Everyone speculated about her true identity. James and his friends would sit in the print shop, drinking beer and debating who Silence really was. Some were convinced she was a real widow. Others suspected she was a man writing under a female pseudonym, which was closer to the truth. Theories multiplied with each new letter. A prominent minister? A wealthy merchant's wife? A visiting intellectual from England? Benjamin stood nearby, setting type or working the press, listening to these speculations with satisfaction that he worked hard to conceal. For the first time in his life, his words were being taken seriously, discussed, and valued. Not because of who he was, but because of what he had written. The experience taught him a profound lesson about the power of ideas separated from social status. In print, a 15-year-old apprentice could command the same attention as a Harvard graduate or a wealthy gentleman, as long as the words themselves were good enough. Over the next several months, Benjamin wrote and secretly submitted 14 silenced dogwood letters. Each one addressed different aspects of Boston society. She wrote about freedom of speech and freedom of thought, arguing that suppressing ideas was both wrong and ineffective. She critiqued religious hypocrisy, noting the gap between professed beliefs and actual behavior. She defended the rights of women to education and intellectual engagement. The essays also revealed Benjamin's developing political and social philosophy. Silence argued for practical virtue over empty piety, for common sense over elaborate theory, for judging people by their actions rather than their words or social position. These themes would recur throughout Franklin's later writing, from Poor Richard's Almanac to his diplomatic correspondence, but the deception could not last forever. After the 14th letter, Benjamin's pride overcame his caution. He revealed himself as the author of the silenced dogwood letters. The reaction in the print shop was complex. Some of the men were impressed by the teenage apprentice's talent. Others felt fooled and embarrassed that they had praised his work without knowing its source. James was furious. His younger brother had made a fool of him, had proven himself more talented as a writer, had claimed the credit for the Corinth's most popular feature. The power dynamic in the shop, already strained, shifted visibly. The other apprentices and even some customers began to see Benjamin differently. He was not just a clever boy, but a genuine writer, someone with talent that commanded respect. James responded by exercising his authority as master over apprentice with increasing harshness. He used physical punishment more frequently, beating Benjamin for infractions real or imagined. The beatings were legal and socially accepted. Masters had the right to discipline apprentices. Physical punishment was considered normal and necessary for teaching obedience and building character. But Benjamin, now aware of his own abilities and beginning to develop his own identity, resented the treatment intensely. He later wrote that his brother's harsh treatment during these years filled him with aversion to arbitrary. Power that has stuck to me through my whole life, the experience of being subject to authority that was legal but unjust, shaped his political thinking profoundly. Meanwhile, the New England Courant continued to publish controversial content that infuriated Boston's establishment. James wrote pieces criticizing the colonial government, mocking official proclamations, and questioning the wisdom of various policies. The authorities tolerated this for a time, but in 1722, James published something that crossed a line. He made a satirical comment suggesting that the government was not seriously pursuing pirates who threatened colonial shipping. The implication was that officials might be profiting from the piracy through bribery or other corrupt arrangements. The government responded swiftly and harshly. James Franklin was arrested and jailed for a month for contempt of the legislature. When he was released, the authorities forbade him to publish the New England Courant. The order was clear and legally binding. James Franklin could no longer serve as publisher of his own newspaper. The solution to this legal problem created an opportunity that would eventually lead to Benjamin's freedom. To continue publishing the Courant, James needed a new publisher of record. He decided to transfer the paper to his younger brother's name. At 16 years old, Benjamin Franklin nominally became the publisher of the New England Courant. To make the arrangement legally credible, James publicly canceled Benjamin's apprenticeship indentures. But privately, secretly, James forced Benjamin to sign new indentures binding him to continue serving until age 21. These secret documents were not filed with the court or made public. They existed only as leverage. It's insurance that Benjamin would not actually claim the freedom that his public status as a free printer should have granted him. The contradiction was unsustainable. Benjamin was legally free, but practically enslaved, publicly independent, but privately bound. James attempted to maintain the pretense, continuing to treat Benjamin as an apprentice, subject to his authority. But Benjamin now understood that he held power in this relationship. The secret indentures were unenforceable precisely because they were secret. If James tried to enforce them, he would have to reveal that the entire arrangement was a fraud, which would expose him to legal consequences. The relationship deteriorated completely. James's beatings became more frequent and more severe. Benjamin's resentment grew more bitter. The shop that had once been a place of learning and excitement became a prison where every day brought humiliation and anger. In September 1723, after one beating too many, 17-year-old Benjamin Franklin made a decision that would change his life. He would run away, would leave Boston, leave his family, leave the only world he had ever known, and seek his fortune elsewhere. It was a momentous decision. Breaking an apprenticeship was a serious offense, even if the indentures were secret and unenforceable. James made sure that no printer in Boston would hire his runaway brother, but Benjamin was determined, sold some of his precious books to raise money for passage. He told his friend John Collins about his plan, swearing him to secrecy. Collins helped him book passage on a ship to New York, telling the captain that Benjamin was fleeing from an unfortunate romantic entanglement, rather than revealing that he was a runaway apprentice. In October 1723, Benjamin Franklin boarded a sloop bound for New York. He left with almost nothing. A few coins in his pocket, the clothes on his back, and a mind full of knowledge that no one could take away. He was 17 years old, a fugitive from his legal obligations, with no connections and little money. The journey ahead would test him in ways he could not imagine, but it would also reveal resources of character and ability that would carry him to heights that no one in Boston, least of all his brother James, could have predicted. As the ship pulled away from the wharf and Boston's skyline receded behind him, Benjamin Franklin was leaving his childhood behind. The boy who had cut wicks in his father's tallow chandler shop, who had taught himself to write by candlelight, had created Silence Doggood, and made all of Boston laugh without anyone knowing his name, was sailing toward an unknown future. He had no way of knowing that he was also sailing toward greatness, toward discoveries that would illuminate the world, toward a role in creating a new nation. He knew only that he was free, and that freedom, even uncertain freedom, with an unknown destination, was better than the certain misery of remaining in his brother's shop. The voyage to New York would be just the beginning of a longer journey, one that would eventually lead to Philadelphia, to London, to Paris, to the courts of kings and the company of philosophers. But for now, on that October day in 1723, Benjamin Franklin was simply a teenage runaway, watching Boston disappear behind him and wondering what lay ahead in the vast unknown world beyond the horizon. Chapter 4. The Runaway's Transformation. The boat journey to New York took 3 days through rough autumn seas. The sloop was small, perhaps 40 feet long, carrying cargo and a handful of passengers in cramped conditions. The waves were high, driven by October winds that announced winter's approach. Benjamin spent much of the journey on deck, despite the spray and cold, watching the coastline slide past and thinking about the choice he had made. Leaving Boston meant leaving everything familiar. His family, his friends, the streets he had walked since childhood. His mother would worry. His father would be disappointed. His brother would be angry. But the alternative, remaining in a situation where he was beaten and belittled despite his obvious abilities, had become intolerable. Sometimes the only way forward is to walk away from everything you know and trust that something better waits beyond the horizon. The ship arrived in New York on a gray afternoon. The city was smaller than Boston, perhaps 10,000 people, but it had a different character. Founded by the Dutch as New Amsterdam and only taken by the English 60 years earlier, it retained a cosmopolitan flavor that Puritan Boston lacked. You could hear Dutch, German, and French spoken in the streets alongside English. The architecture showed Dutch influence in its steep-roofed brick buildings and stepped gables. Benjamin went immediately to the printing shop of William Bradford, New York's only printer. Bradford was an older man, established in his trade, and he listened to the story of this young man who claimed to be a trained printer seeking work. But Bradford had no positions available. His own son handled most of the work, and business was not strong enough to justify hiring another hand. However, Bradford mentioned that his son Andrew ran a printing shop in Philadelphia and might need help. With nothing to lose, Benjamin decided to continue south. The journey to Philadelphia became an ordeal that would test his resilience and determination in ways the relatively easy sea voyage to New York had not.
He took a boat across New York Bay toward Perth Amboy, intending to continue overland from there. But the weather turned violent. A squall caught the small boat in open water, and for hours they fought the waves, passengers and crew bailing frantically to keep from sinking. Benjamin later wrote that a drunken Dutch passenger fell overboard, and he managed to reach down into the water and grab the man by his hair, pulling him back into the boat. Whether the story was entirely accurate or somewhat embellished, the experience was clearly terrifying. They finally reached shore, drenched and exhausted. Benjamin was developing a fever, shivering uncontrollably in his wet clothes with no way to get warm. He walked 50 miles from Perth Amboy to Burlington, through rain that never seemed to stop, his shoes falling apart, his feet blistering, his clothes never fully drying. He slept in barns and cheap taverns, spending the few coins he had on minimal food and shelter. At Burlington, he caught a boat down the Delaware River toward Philadelphia. The journey took all night. The boat was packed with passengers, and Benjamin, exhausted and feverish, fell asleep. When he woke, they had sailed past Philadelphia in the darkness and had to row back against the current. He finally arrived in Philadelphia on Sunday morning, October 6, 1723. He was dirty, disheveled, exhausted, and feverish. His clothes were filthy and torn. He had spent nearly all his money on the journey. He had $3 Dutch remaining in his pocket, and he was completely alone in a city where he knew no one. He walked up from the wharf into Market Street, looking for food. He found a bakery and went inside, asking for 3 pennies worth of bread. The baker, unfamiliar with Boston currency, gave him 3 enormous puffy rolls. Benjamin, too hungry to care about appearance, tucked 1 roll under each arm and walked down Market Street eating the 3rd, so focused on satisfying his hunger that he barely noticed how ridiculous he must have looked. A young woman stood in a doorway watching him pass. She later told him that she had laughed at the sight of this bedraggled stranger with bread under his arms. Her name was Deborah Reed, and 7 years later, she would become his wife. But on that Sunday morning, Benjamin Franklin was just a ridiculous stranger, exhausted, dirty, and alone. He followed other people to a Quaker meeting house and sat down in a pew. Quaker services were conducted in silence, with members speaking only when moved by the Spirit. Benjamin, exhausted beyond measure, promptly fell asleep. When he woke, the service was ending. Someone directed him to a clean-looking house where he could find lodging, and he slept for hours, the deep sleep of someone who has reached a destination after a difficult journey. The next morning, Monday, October 7th, 1723, Benjamin Franklin began to build the life that would make him famous. He found Andrew Bradford's printing shop and asked for work. Bradford had no openings, but he directed Benjamin to another printer in the city, Samuel Keimer, an eccentric character who needed help. Keimer was a strange man, even by colonial standards. He wore his beard, long in an age when most men were clean-shaven. He kept the Jewish Sabbath, refusing to work from Friday evening to Saturday evening. He had been a printer in London before emigrating to Philadelphia, and he had grand ideas about establishing a successful printing business, but he lacked the discipline and business sense to realize those ambitions. He hired Benjamin on the spot, recognizing immediately that this young man knew far more about printing than he did himself. Within days, the relationship had inverted in practice, if not in title. Keimer relied on Benjamin to manage the shop, to handle the difficult jobs, to maintain the equipment, to deal with demanding customers. Philadelphia was different from Boston in ways that went beyond mere size. Founded by Quakers under William Penn's charter, the city had been designed from the beginning to welcome people of all faiths. There were Quakers, certainly, but also Anglicans, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Catholics, and Jews. The Quaker emphasis on tolerance and practical commerce created an atmosphere of openness that contrasted sharply with Boston's Puritan conformity. The city itself was laid out in a rational grid pattern, streets running perpendicular to each other, numbered and named systematically. It was more orderly than Boston's medieval tangle of streets that followed old cowpaths and property lines. The Delaware River provided access to the Atlantic, and Philadelphia's port was growing rapidly. By 1723, the population was approaching 10,000, and the city was on its way to becoming the largest in the American colonies. Benjamin found lodging with the Reed family, the same household where the young woman who had laughed at him lived. Deborah Reed was about 16, cheerful and pretty, and Benjamin began courting her almost immediately. Her parents seemed to approve of the intelligent young printer who was making his way in their city. He also began making friends, something he did easily throughout his life. His wit, his learning, and his conversational skills drew people to him. He joined informal groups of young men who gathered to debate and discuss ideas. He became known as an entertaining companion and a brilliant talker. It was during this early Philadelphia period that Governor William Keith noticed the articulate young printer and made an offer that seemed too good to be true. Unfortunately, it was too good to be true. Keith proposed to back Benjamin in establishing his own printing shop, offering to provide letters of credit that would allow him to travel to London, purchase the best printing equipment, and set up in business with the governor as a silent partner. Benjamin's father, whom he had visited briefly in Boston, attempting a reconciliation, advised caution. Josiah Franklin told his son that Governor Keith's promises seemed too generous, too unlikely to materialize from someone who barely knew Benjamin. But 17-year-old Benjamin wanted to believe. He wanted the opportunity that Keith was offering. He returned to Philadelphia, accepted the governor's proposal, and in November 1724, boarded a ship for London. The voyage across the Atlantic took weeks. As the ship approached England, Benjamin asked the captain about Governor Keith's letters. The captain said they were in a bag with other mail and would be sorted when they reached London. When they finally docked and the mail was sorted, Benjamin discovered the crushing truth. There were no letters of credit from Governor Keith. No letters of introduction. No financial backing. Nothing. Governor Keith, it turned out, was known for making grand promises that he had neither the means nor the intention of keeping. He encouraged young men with airy assurances and generous offers that evaporated upon examination. Benjamin Franklin was stranded in London, 18 years old, thousands of miles from home, with no money, no equipment, and no prospects. It was December 1724. The London winter was cold and damp, coal smoke hanging in the air, creating the famous London fog that turned buildings black and made breathing difficult. Benjamin was completely alone in one of the largest cities in the world, abandoned by the governor who had promised to make his fortune. A lesser person might have despaired. A less resourceful person might have begged for passage home. But Benjamin Franklin had learned something important about himself during the difficult journey from Boston to Philadelphia. He could survive. He could adapt. He could find opportunities where others saw only obstacles. If Governor Keith would not support him, he would support himself. The next 18 months in London would test and refine every skill he possessed. They would expose him to ideas and experiences impossible to find in colonial America. They would teach him about human nature, about the differences between appearance and reality, about the importance of judging people by their actions rather than their words. And they would ultimately convince him that his future lay not in England, with its rigid class system and limited opportunities for someone of his background, but in America, where talent could triumph over birth, and where the future was being created by people who refused to accept that their origins defined their destinies. Chapter 5. London Lessons and Philadelphia Success. London in December 1724 was overwhelming in its scale and complexity. Benjamin had thought Boston large with its 7,000 inhabitants, and Philadelphia impressive with 10,000. London had more than 600,000 people, making it one of the largest cities on earth. The population density was staggering. Narrow streets packed with humanity, from wealthy merchants in fine clothes to beggars in rags, from street vendors hawking their wares to prostitutes soliciting customers. from apprentices running errands to gentlemen riding in sedan chairs. The noise was constant and overwhelming. Vendors shouted their offerings: hot pies, fresh oysters, knives to grind. Hackney coaches clattered over cobblestones, worn smooth by centuries of traffic. Church bells rang the hours. Street musicians played for coins. Arguments erupted and subsided. The city never fell completely silent, even at night. The smell was equally intense. Coal smoke from thousands of household fires mixed with the stench of human waste from overflowing cesspits and open sewers. The Thames itself was both highway and sewer, crowded with ships bringing goods from around the world, but also receiving all of London's refuse. Tanneries contributed their acrid chemical smell. Breweries released the sweet scent of fermenting grain. The fish markets by the river added their own distinctive aroma. For someone from the relatively clean air of colonial America, it was almost nauseating at first. But humans can adapt to almost anything, and within weeks, Benjamin barely noticed the smells that had initially overwhelmed him. He had more pressing concerns. He needed work, and he needed it immediately. He found employment at Samuel Palmer's printing house in Bartholomew Close, one of the finest print shops in London. Palmer's establishment was far larger and more sophisticated than anything in America. The shop employed dozens of men operating multiple presses, producing work of extraordinary quality for demanding customers. The London printers initially viewed the young American with skepticism. Colonials were considered provincial, backward, crude in their skills. But Benjamin quickly demonstrated abilities that matched or exceeded those of the London journeyman. He could compose type faster than most of them, his fingers moving through the type case with practiced precision learned in James's shop and refined by his own determination to excel. His knowledge of the printing process was comprehensive. He understood not just the mechanical operations, but the finer points of the craft. The London pressmen had a custom that Franklin found wasteful. They believed that drinking beer throughout the workday gave them strength for the heavy labor of operating the press. Some men consumed 6 pints during a single shift, spending much of their wages at the alehouse and arriving at work half drunk. Benjamin drank only water, earning himself the nickname, the Water American. He argued that beer actually weakened the body and dulled the mind, that bread provided better energy for sustained work. His fellow workers mocked him initially, but his superior work output gradually convinced some of them. The man who drank water could lift as much, work as long, and produce better quality than those who believed alcohol was necessary for strength. He lived frugally in a boarding house in Little Britain, near St. Paul's Cathedral. His room was barely large enough for a bed and a small table. He ate simple meals and spent what little money he could save on books. While other young journeymen spent their evenings in taverns and gaming houses, Franklin read, studied, and thought about his future. London offered intellectual stimulation that was impossible to find in America. Coffee houses served as informal universities where writers, thinkers, and intellectuals gathered to read newspapers, discuss the latest publications, and debate everything from poetry to politics. For the price of a cup of coffee, a man could spend hours reading journals that would cost a week's wages to purchase. Franklin became a regular at several coffee houses near the print shops where he worked. He visited bookshops, spending hours browsing volumes he could not afford to buy, but could read in part while standing in the shop. He befriended other young men of intellectual ambition, forming an informal club where they shared their writings and critiqued each other's work. During this period, Franklin wrote and printed a pamphlet titled A Dissertation on Liberty and Necessity, Pleasure and Pain. It was a work of youthful philosophy, arguing that if God is all-powerful and all-knowing, then free will is an illusion. Everything is predetermined by God's eternal knowledge. Vice and virtue are equally natural, equally part of God's plan. The pamphlet demonstrated Franklin's ability to construct logical arguments, but it led to conclusions he would later reject as dangerous. If morality has no basis, if virtue is meaningless, then what prevents society from descending into chaos? Franklin would spend much of his later life developing a practical ethical framework that avoided both religious dogmatism and moral nihilism. The pamphlet did make him some influential friends, including William Lyons, a surgeon and amateur scientist impressed by Franklin's reasoning ability. But more importantly, it taught Franklin a lesson about ideas. Some thoughts are better left unpublished, or at least published with more maturity and consideration of their practical consequences. After about a year at Palmer's, Franklin moved to Watts's printing house near Lincoln's Inn Fields, an even larger establishment employing 50 men. He worked in the press room, the most physically demanding position. Operating a hand press required significant strength and stamina, and Franklin thrived on it. He was young, strong, and motivated. But despite his professional success and intellectual growth, Benjamin was lonely. He had written to Deborah Reed regularly during his first months in London, but gradually the letters stopped. The distance was too great, the obstacles too numerous. Their understanding, never formalized, simply lapsed. Franklin later admitted feeling guilty about this abandonment, recognizing that he had wronged her through his neglect. By spring 1726, Benjamin had decided that London, magnificent as it was, would never offer him the opportunities he sought. The city was too established, too hierarchical, too bound by tradition. Here he would always be a skilled worker, respected within his trade, but limited by it. In America, a man could rise. The opportunities were real, the society more fluid. He found a merchant named Thomas Denham, who needed a clerk and was returning to Philadelphia. Denham offered Franklin a job, promising to teach him the merchant's trade. It meant leaving printing temporarily, but it offered passage home and the chance to learn skills that could lead to greater wealth than the printing trade typically offered. In July 1726, Benjamin Franklin boarded a ship bound for Philadelphia. The voyage took 11 weeks due to contrary winds and storms. Franklin spent the time writing, recording observations about nature, and developing the ethical framework that would guide his later life. He was moving away from the moral relativism of his dissertation toward a more practical understanding of virtue. When the ship finally arrived in Philadelphia in October 1726, Benjamin stepped ashore a different person from the 18-year-old who had left. He had seen the world beyond colonial America. He had tested himself and proven his abilities. He was home, and he was ready to build something extraordinary. Over the next several years, Franklin established himself as Philadelphia's premier printer. He worked briefly for Denham until the merchant's sudden death, then returned to printing with Kiemer before forming a partnership with Hugh Meredith. When Meredith's drinking problems made the partnership untenable, Franklin borrowed money to buy him out and became sole proprietor at age 24. He worked with relentless energy, up before dawn, working late into the night, personally visible doing the hard work of the trade. He would push a wheelbarrow loaded with paper through the streets, demonstrating his industry to potential customers. While other tradesmen spent evenings in taverns, Franklin was at his press. In 1729, he bought a failing newspaper called the Pennsylvania Gazette and transformed it into the most successful paper in the colonies. He wrote many articles himself, mixing news with essays and practical information. The Gazette was lively, readable, and profitable. His most successful publication began in December 1732, Poor Richard's Almanac. The annual calendar was filled with weather predictions, astronomical information, and pithy sayings attributed to the fictional Richard Saunders. The almanac sold 10,000 copies per year, an extraordinary number for colonial America, and made Franklin financially comfortable. In 1730, he entered into a common law marriage with Deborah Reed, whose legal situation remained complicated from a previous marriage. Their household included Benjamin's illegitimate son William, and later their own children. Deborah managed the printing business's retail operations and proved to be a capable partner. By age 30, Franklin's printing business was successful enough that he could hire managers and reduce his direct involvement. This gave him time to pursue other interests, and it was then that Benjamin Franklin began his transformation from successful tradesman to scientist, inventor, and public servant. The discoveries that would make him internationally famous were about to begin, starting with questions about the nature of electricity and culminating in experiments that would draw lightning from the sky and change human understanding of the natural world forever. Chapter 6. Experiments, Inventions, and Revolution. The transformation from printer to natural philosopher began quietly, with questions that most people never thought to ask. Why does smoke rise in a chimney? What makes some fabrics warmer than others, despite being equally thick? Why do ships sail faster in some ocean currents than others? Benjamin Franklin approached these questions not as abstract curiosities, but as practical problems that might have practical solutions. His first significant invention addressed a common problem in colonial homes: inefficient heating. Traditional fireplaces sent most of their heat up the chimney while filling rooms with smoke. Franklin spent months studying the problem, making sketches, building models, testing different configurations. The result was the Pennsylvania fireplace, later called the Franklin stove, a cast iron device that could be placed in the middle of a room, radiating heat in all directions while venting smoke safely outside. The stove was brilliant in its simplicity. It used significantly less wood than a traditional fireplace while producing much more usable heat. It made homes more comfortable and reduced the exhausting labor of chopping and hauling firewood. The governor of Pennsylvania offered Franklin a patent that would have made him wealthy. Franklin refused, publishing detailed plans so anyone could build or improve upon the design. His reasoning was characteristic. As we enjoy great advantages from the inventions of others, we should be glad of an opportunity to serve others by any invention of ours, and this we should do freely and generously. This pattern of sharing discoveries freely, rather than profiting from them, would define his scientific career. But the work that made Franklin internationally famous began with a simple observation about lightning. In the early 1740s, he became fascinated by electricity, then one of the most mysterious phenomena in natural philosophy. European scientists had discovered that certain materials, when rubbed, could attract small objects or produce sparks. They performed electrical demonstrations as entertainment, making sparks fly and objects move through invisible forces. But no one truly understood what electricity was or what principles governed it. Franklin began conducting systematic experiments with a Leyden jar obtained from a London correspondent. Through careful observation and testing, he made several crucial discoveries. He identified positive and negative electrical charges, terms we still use today. He realized that electricity was transferred between objects rather than created, that electrical charge is conserved. These were fundamental insights that transformed scientific understanding. But Franklin's boldest hypothesis was yet to come. Lightning was electrical in nature, the same phenomenon that produced sparks when you shuffled across a carpet, only vastly larger in scale. He proposed an experiment to test this hypothesis. In June 1752, Franklin and his son William flew a kite during a thunderstorm. The kite had a wire attached to its tip, and a metal key was tied to the hemp string near the bottom. When the rain-soaked string became conductive, the loose fibers stood erect, repelled by electrical charge. Franklin brought his knuckle near the key and drew sparks. Lightning was electricity. The heavens and the laboratory were governed by the same principles. The experiment was extraordinarily dangerous, and Franklin was fortunate not to have been killed. But it proved his hypothesis and led to his most important practical invention, the lightning rod. If lightning was electrical, buildings could be protected by installing pointed metal rods that would conduct the charge safely into the ground. Within years, lightning rods were installed on buildings throughout America and Europe. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Structures that would have burned were protected. The number of lives and buildings saved is beyond counting, certainly in the thousands over the centuries since Franklin's invention. The Royal Society of London awarded him the Copley Medal in 1753, their highest honor. Yale and Harvard granted him honorary degrees. The University of St. Andrews made him a Doctor of Laws. Oxford followed with a Doctor of Civil Law degree. The boy who never finished formal schooling was now Dr. Franklin, honored by the most prestigious universities in the world. But even as his scientific fame grew, Franklin was increasingly drawn into politics. In 1751, he was elected to the Pennsylvania Assembly. In 1754, he proposed the Albany Plan of Union, a visionary attempt to unite the colonies for common defense. Though rejected at the time, it prefigured the federal structure that would eventually govern the United States. In 1757, Pennsylvania sent Franklin to London as their agent, beginning a period of nearly 2 decades abroad. He worked to represent colonial interests to the British government, but events were moving beyond anyone's control. Britain began imposing new taxes on the colonies. The Stamp Act of 1765 provoked riots and boycotts. Franklin's testimony before Parliament helped secure its repeal, but the underlying conflict remained unresolved. The relationship between Britain and the colonies deteriorated steadily. New taxes, new restrictions, new assertions of parliamentary authority over colonial affairs. The Boston Massacre in 1770, the Boston Tea Party in 1773, the Coercive Acts in 1774. Each crisis pushed the colonies closer to rebellion. In January 1774, Franklin was publicly humiliated before the Privy Council, accused of stealing letters and inflaming colonial resistance. He stood silent while the Solicitor General spent an hour attacking his character and loyalty. Something broke inside him that day. 18 years of trying to preserve the empire through reasonable compromise were over. In March 1775, Franklin sailed for Philadelphia. He arrived to find that war had already begun at Lexington and Concord. At age 69, Benjamin Franklin was about to help create a nation. Congress elected him as a delegate the day after he arrived. He helped draft the Declaration of Independence, making important edits to Thomas Jefferson's prose. On July 4, 1776, he signed the document that declared him a traitor to the British Crown. But his most crucial service came as commissioner to France. At age 70, he crossed the Atlantic in wartime, risking capture by British warships. His mission was to secure French military and financial support for the American cause. He succeeded brilliantly. The French adored this charming old man in a fur cap who represented natural wisdom from the New World. He negotiated, lobbied, and cultivated relationships with every influential figure in French politics. In February 1778, he signed treaties that bound France to military support for American independence. Without French support, the American Revolution likely would have failed. The French military aid, including crucial naval support at Yorktown in 1781, tipped the balance. Franklin remained in France until 1785, managing the complex alliance and serving as America's face in Europe. He returned to Philadelphia in September 1785 to a hero's welcome. But even at 79, he could not rest. Pennsylvania elected him governor. In 1787, despite painful ailments, he attended the Constitutional Convention. At the crucial moment when the convention nearly collapsed, Franklin delivered a speech urging compromise and humility that helped save the proceedings. He signed the Constitution on September 17, 1787, becoming the only person to sign all 4 founding documents: the Declaration of Independence, the Treaty of Alliance with France, the Treaty of Paris, and the Constitution. His final years were spent at home, writing his autobiography and serving as president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. In February 1790, weeks before his death, he signed a petition to Congress calling for the abolition of slavery. On April 17, 1790, Benjamin Franklin died at home, surrounded by family. He was 84 years old. 20,000 people attended his funeral. half of Philadelphia's population. The French National Assembly declared 3 days of mourning, the first time they honored a foreigner. The legacy he left was vast. Scientific discoveries that transformed human understanding, inventions that saved countless lives, institutions that endure centuries later, diplomatic achievements that made American independence possible, contributions to the founding documents that created a nation. But perhaps his greatest legacy was proving that in the New World, genius could emerge from anywhere, that talent mattered more than birth, that one person's curiosity and determination could genuinely change the world. The runaway apprentice with bread under his arms became one of the most influential people in history. He drew lightning from the sky, charmed the courts of Europe, and helped create a nation. He proved that circumstances of birth need not determine destiny, that knowledge pursued with discipline opens doors, that service to community enriches individual lives. 230 years after his death, Benjamin Franklin's light still illuminates. His life reminds us that tomorrow can be better than today, that practical wisdom can change the world, that one person committed to making things better actually can make a difference. As you drift towards sleep tonight, let his example inspire your dreams. The boy who loved to read by candlelight brought electricity to the world. The apprentice who ran away with nothing built institutions that endure. The tradesman who never attended university became honored by the world's finest institutions. His sun was indeed rising, not setting, and in the nation he helped create, in the values he championed, in the institutions he founded, that sun still shines. Rest now in the knowledge that human potential knows few limits, that curiosity and determination can overcome any obstacle, that each of us, regardless of our beginnings, can contribute something meaningful to the world. Good night.